'Cause I've always never believed in you. I never once doubting you. With every opportunity that you blew, all my worst fears just kept coming true.
Insert standard joke of how did we get 3 Pinocchios in 1 year? Well, technically we had 4, almost 5. A year of 3 Pinocchios may seem improbable, though it does make it slightly more probable since many pandemic-delayed projects basically all got similar release times over the past 2 years. 2020 technically would have been the 80th anniversary of the Disney film, but given how long Del Toro's has been in production, it wouldn't surprise me if Disney decided to release this one on their laundry list of remakes deliberately in his path. If not maliciously, then just to ride the algorithm. But then there's the true story of the truest Pinocchio, the absolute truest one who absolutely does not grow his nose when he lies. But we know if it wasn't for the bizarre performance of Pauly Shore, whose voice was pretty much made for the meme generation, no one would know that this movie existed.
Father, tell me, when can I leave to be on my own? I'm a boy and I'm alive! I've got the whole world to see. I want to meet other people. Great adventures await!
Otherwise, it's just kind of typically bad, which makes it a tad frustrating for some who may be looking for the source of all of these memorable TikTok clips, that there are actually 2 English dubs. The other just has Pinocchio with a generic English accent that just isn't nearly as funny.
Father, tell me, when can I leave to be on my own?
But there's also the horse, played by John Heater, who has plenty of his own odd deliveries. But what's just as weird is the character itself, who feels like an elementary level self-insert. I'm the main character's best friend, and his confidant, and his adopted family, and his mentor, and I'm so much smarter than everyone else in this movie. Not to mention Pinocchio's design, which is so much more human than literally everyone else. If we didn't see him being carved in the beginning and surviving a bullet, no one would know that he was made out of wood. It's a by-the-book, dollar store bin animated film that just has slightly more weird performances than normal. Also, the end where the circus performers reveal their thieving boss's scam to the audience in song, and the last minute, "You were my father the entire time," those happened. But let's be honest, while this one may be objectively inferior, we at least got some joy and emotional response from this Pinocchio than the whole of the Disney remake. Another honorary worst. But Marmaduke might be worse than both of them. Marmaduke's animation, at least conceptually, is a lot more creative and cartoony, but the physics just don't physic. Like, pick your poison, but this one physically hurts to watch. That would be objectively the worst of 2022, but if I'm talking about my personal experience and what shocked and disgusted me, I'm going to have to be a massive cheat because that is something that's technically been around for years, and I am shocked that basically nobody has talked about it. What the absolute fuck is Epcot's Beauty and the Beast sing-along, and why does it exist? This is straight up somewhat comedic hyperbole, which I am admitting because I know that even saying this out loud will lead you to have expectations that it likely can't meet. So giving you some extra seconds to skip this part or watch it for yourselves on YouTube before I tell you why it's so horrifying, dropping the shoe, they turn Beauty and the Beast into LeFou's Wicked. Yep, they animated new footage to show how LeFou was actually the good guy behind the scenes, at least mildly assisting the main characters and insulting Gaston behind his back. He cooked Belle's dinner, he designed Belle's dress, he was already in the castle when the mob came. And you're like, wait, isn't there a famous clip of him being part of the mob? Yes! Yes, there is! But because of its lighthearted delivery, I suppose it's not crazy to wave this off as just an amusing distraction and stuff. Personally, I just cannot abide trying to canonize any aspect of the live-action Beauty and the Beast into the animated universe. That is sacrilege, and I cannot allow it.
The cringe.
It was not my best work.
We do the cringe.
In fairness, I was also high.
I have a taut relationship with the Hotel Transylvania series, specifically that I notoriously dislike Drac as a dad character, though I still find a decent amount of enjoyment in his mannerisms and comedy as well as the Looney Tunes animation overall. So I've been more or less tolerant of the franchise's existence through the knowledge that its real purpose was to bankroll Gendy's other more interesting projects. So for anyone who still hasn't watched Primal, do something about that. So I had very nothing feelings about the fact that this was going to be the last one, other than the mild curiosity of why Sandler was no longer involved, and with still no official reason given, but I honestly don't care that much. I barely noticed he was gone, as his voice was taken up by YouTube impersonator Brian Hull, who had already been doing his voice on some other occasions and I thought did a really good job. But it was probably an early signifier that the movie was bought out of its theatrical run to be an Amazon exclusive. And granted, I was kind of amused by the premise of the monsters turning into humans, but then all of the notably funny moments were all in the trailer. We did get a handful of scenes with Mavis and her stepmom, which was the bare minimum I was hoping for, but then all that remains in the movie is yet another story about Dracula lying to his daughter and spending the entire time beefing with his son-in-law, the often more disliked character in the series, usually for dumb Flash Century related reasons. I don't care for father versus daughter's boyfriend stories on a regular basis. This is 3 movies after they've gotten married. And for another story of Drac being a selfish ass who's scared of the future, how is this still the only story idea you can come up with about a hotel full of classic horror movie monsters? It does still have the snappy animation, which maintains some of the comedic momentum, but even that at times got a little excessive. Even amongst its fans, this one was poorly received. But I have zero cares for the hopefully small base that got somehow upset at the reveal of the Invisible Man's human design, because it didn't look enough like Percy from Vox Machina. I'll repeat it again, children. Creators do not owe you confirmations of your fan theories. And mild nitpick, but can we partially speculate on the implications of why Van Helsing had a ray that turned humans into monsters and vice versa? Because it sounds like a very roundabout way just to be a serial killer. There are some speculations on whether this actually is the last movie, but many seem to be pretty bored with the franchise anyway. And I easily got a lot more entertainment out of Gendy's Popeyes storyboard that leaked. This should be standard procedure for every cancelled film. And continuing my pattern of throwing in movies at the tail end because I don't want to dedicate an entire section to them, Roderick Rules, another CG diary of a wimpy kid. I do like this one better than the last one, but still I have no idea if they're gonna use the doodle designs why this isn't 2D. This looks so cheap and terrible. Adventures of Buck Wild. Disney killed Blue Sky Studios and dares to prop up its corpse. Even for people who like Buck, the animation is worse, and the new villain sucks. Otherwise, it may not feel that different from the other Ice Age movies, but I was never crazy about this franchise in the first place, so no thank you.
Any bridge leads to disaster. If its moorings aren't secure, heaven won't provide on the bridge's dark side. It's our wealth which will endure.
The titled Scrooge is a soft remake of the 1970 live-action musical, with songs by the composer of Willy Wonka, who also wrote this screenplay and tragically passed away during the making of this film. So it'd be a little uncomfortable if I had anything negative to say about it. Honestly, the 1970 film, as it is, isn't usually one of the best age adaptations, mostly because Scrooge's performance is,
But not for me, I hate life!
It's a bit hammy, probably fits much better in the musical theater scene, but the tone is generally much more goofy, if you couldn't tell from the scene where Scrooge goes to hell. This movie uses 5 songs out of the existing 8, and takes amount of its dialogue and its blocking and its ideas verbatim, but has certainly made some updates where before Scrooge was an exaggeration of his book persona by assuming his attitude was justified because everyone was just as crooked and horrible as he was, expressed in a bluntly titled song, I Hate People, is replaced by Tell Me, where he admits that he actively hates other people being happy and wants to make them miserable. Expressed in his opening scenes, where now he laughs at his own mockery and taunts of others. This is not my Scrooge. I don't care how much Tumblr loves him. And while I'm generally glad to see another animated Carol with a bigger budget, arguably, the tone of this is excessive, and yeah, a lot of that has to do with these visuals. This is like taking the book and dousing it in costume jewelry, going from melodramatically angsty to Broadway-style showstopper, to obnoxious kitty pandering between those stupid fairies, and past not being able to shut up! Kid movies, stop. Stop doing the joke where you make fun of how historical characters' names sound. You are not allowed to do that anymore. So yeah, this movie has run into that CGI visual effects toy box paradox, where when given the opportunity to be as creative and over the top as you want, it's difficult for animators to hold themselves back sometimes. I'll take Belle and Ebenezer's love song taking place amongst the stars, and then there's Present's giant atrium and Broadway-style showstopper, which makes some sense given that he's played by the Broadway actor who has often played the genie. Yeah, there's more than a couple of direct Disney homages in this as well, which I'd be much more amenable to if it wasn't for those stupid fairies. But if there is a single element that showcases how extra this movie is, it's the design of Ghost Marley, with puffed up clothes and the chains and the eyes and the ice and the fire and the wind and the lightning. It's too much. There is too much going on here. It can be very easy for this movie to overwhelm people. But aside from the obvious caveat where at least it's something different, there are some things here that I appreciate. It's not Muppets, but half the songs are effective, mostly Belle and Scrooge's song, and the darkly comedic Thank You won an award back in the day. But my favorite addition are 1, turning the Ghost of Christmas Present into a literal candle, allowing for the perception that her being made of wax explains her amorphous nature to turn into other beings. If only she wasn't so annoying! And this includes the way that she dies by cracking and breaking apart. And that alludes to the best change, the idea that the spirits turn into each other. Past's flame becomes Present's flame, and then Present's death turns him into future. That is so obviously brilliant. How has this never been done before? It is certainly capable of being enjoyed, but it's right on the hinge on whether that enjoyment is sincere or ironic.
Today's gonna be exceptional, never boring even for a minute. It's my world and we're all living in it.
New studio Skydance's first movie, Luck, about a girl with perpetual bad luck getting wrapped up in the ordeal of a luck factory. And whether or not this is the product of Skydance's new leadership, it's a pretty mediocre Disney clone. Admittedly, the movie did have several production problems, including having to change directors, and boy, that sounds familiar. Ultimately, Luck is a watchable movie, and that's mostly due to Sam and Bob the cat working well off each other. Sam's history with bad luck is sympathetic, and you understand why she's so determined and frustrated. Certainly, there's humor to be had in the various bad luck occurrences and reactions, and the penny Celtic knot scene is that whimsically convoluted you expect in a fantasy factory. But there are just several things about it that are bafflingly off. In the very first scene, I instantly got the vibe of cheap animation for girls like Barbie, in that the smiles felt so perpetual and unnatural. That the facial expressions feel restricted and minimal is an ongoing problem. Not every character, but there are times when the face and voice just does not match. But then, why is this movie so oddly long for an animated film, and why is the story so weirdly complicated? We have certainly seen corporations of fictional concept stories be done hundreds of times. Monsters, Inc. was not the first. But if there is a single thing that makes the premise of Monsters, Inc. work infinitely better, it's because its factory has a purpose. Why does Monsters, Inc. exist? It's a power company. They need to scare children to harvest screams for power. Why does the Luck Factory exist? No idea. Hell, even Baby Corp has a reason why it exists. There is so much time spent on explaining how the factory works for the sake of contriving a conflict, as to explaining why luck needs to be manufactured and distributed. There's never a satisfying explanation given as to why they just don't give everyone good luck. However, the moral on how to deal with bad luck, I do kinda like, even though DuckTales was able to convey the same message with Gladstone in a collective 3 minutes by seeing how incapable he was without his good luck.
Not one gust of wind whimsically carried me! Is this what life is like for you people? Ow! Why weren't there pillows there?
Still, the point is made with her being so capable and hopeful and resilient. It just took a long time to get there.
Your cat is not a dog.
Well, this this one's had a journey. If you feel like you've seen a poster for Blazing Samurai for a decade, it's because you have. Greenlit in 2010, shifting between studios after they couldn't pay their employees, and its stint with crowdsourcing its animation. Then there's the whole animated, family-friendly version of the iconically adult Blazing Saddles, which is likely why its earlier name was changed, because even association with a rated R comedy would probably instill enough doubt in parents to play it safe and avoid it. Also, if more people knew that this was based on Blazing Saddles, they would probably expect it to be funnier than it is. But you can't use this as evidence for why Blazing Saddles can't be made today, because this barely tries to be anything like it outside of broad narrative beats and taking a few of its jokes directly. Samuel L. Jackson does a decent job as Gene Wilder's character, who is absolutely nothing like Gene Wilder, but the biggest reason is that Hank the protagonist is the worst thing in this movie, whereas Cleveland Little is one of the best things about the original. As the clever newcomer using his wit to outsmart all of the dumb racists, Michael Cera is just a cliche, I want to be a great warrior, and then finds this old disgraced warrior teacher story. It tries to lightly still touch on the racism angle with dogs and cats, but it's not exactly giving Zootopia a run for its money. So yeah, it has way more in common with a generic family animation than Saddles. However, along generic family movie lines, it does have some unique funny jokes. It's just surrounded by other typical generic family stuff, including its typical overdose of this is the part of the story where blank happens. Ugh. Those opening credits though.
It's so relaxing at the zoo, saying what's up to kangaroos. My boys awake 'cause they nocturnal. I really like the zoo.
So this is a weird one because I don't really know where to put it. Odd Taxi is one of those summarize an entire anime series in an hour and a half that I usually would not allow to touch this list. But I also really wanted to use this movie as an excuse to talk about Odd Taxi the series, one of the most unique, well-received, and less-known anime of the past several years. Don't let the anthropomorphic animals fool you, this is an adult murder mystery. A reclusive, snarky walrus somehow gets roped into the disappearance of a young cat girl, becoming entwined with the mob, corrupt cops, a wannabe influencer, a comedy duo, and an upstart idol group. Up front, a big part of the appeal of this is its quirky, Tarantino-esque dialogue, which itself is a standout because anime is known for a lot of things. Unique, compelling dialogue is not one of them. They usually repeat like the same 5 phrases over and over again. But by the end of it, they have masterfully woven together all of these individual character stories into a mystery with a satisfying conclusion. It is already rare to have an original not based on a manga story that concludes in only 12 episodes, even rarer for any anime, or series for that matter, to end with a satisfying conclusion. But the Into the Woods movie, I could never recommend this as a replacement for the series. It barely satisfies as a companion piece for existing fans. While it does provide some extra character interviews that may reveal something interesting, it virtually all feels like needless padding. Especially since the movie does all but completely skip over episode 4, one of the most harrowing character stories of a childhood incident that sparked a very dark turn in a character's life. This movie is deemed pointless just for that. Oh sure, it does technically solve that cliffhanger that was given at the end of the series, but let's not deny that the only reason that even existed was to justify this film, and it's literally just an extra 30 seconds of footage. If seeing the movie was your only option, it would technically be better than nothing. I think newbies would still enjoy it on some level, but I heavily implore that people watch the series in full.
Sail away, sail away, sail away. Sail away, sail away, sail away.
Bubble is a beautiful movie. Or rather, it's 2 beautiful movies squished together. Contemplative aesthetic symbolism, or extreme parkour, using a lot of the techniques that we've learned from Attack on Titan. And I will say, it does have some very cool parkour shots. And sometime amongst the parkour, it eventually becomes a quiet boy with a hearing sensitivity and a bubble girl that appears, that both start kind of quietly liking each other because they're both outsiders and because they stood next to each other for 2 whole minutes. But it was very hard to care about these characters when there's really not too much to them. Yeah, I need to apologize for all of the anime romance movies last year that I called mid, because every single one of them were masterpieces of chemistry compared to these 2. But that's also due to this movie for some reason having a very large amount of characters to vindicate having team parkour events. It introduces like 20 at the start, whom I know are supposed to be significant, but we don't spend enough individual time on. Then we all but abandon the parkour plot, except to add in more cool shots, to focus solely on the two and goes philosophical. Which in a very anime way it does with some impressively subtle ways, like expressing the cyclical nature of existence, reflected in the setting of the crumbling ruins, but with new life and greenery growing, makes this visually a nice change from gray and brown apocalypses. But then we'll just monologue exactly what it's about directly into the audience's face. And also sticking its finger to Little Mermaid every 10 minutes, just so you get the connection. And this doesn't really matter, but when I was just looking it up, there was a CBR article that said 10 anime inspired by Little Mermaid. All of them were literally just anime with mermaids or underwater people in them, and Anthem of the Heart wasn't mentioned once, which was better than anything there. I really do want to reiterate how very pretty and aesthetically pleasing this movie is. I just do not understand why the parkour and the existential bubble girl are shoved into the same movie. The Penguin Highway director has a thing for fantastical concepts that he expects the audience to just kinda go with it, but approaches those concepts in a very practical way, having the characters react to it as realistically as possible. In this case, when your entire town has somehow gotten flooded, and all of the buildings have started floating. And also, other than you, seem to be completely unoccupied. On a structural level, this movie is certainly better than Bubble, just in terms of it having a story that's way more focused and characters that get enough expansion that you care about what they're going through. Just my only problem is that I kind of hate these kids. Or rather, two kids specifically. Your classic alpha bitch and angry boy keep ruining the story for everyone else. I cannot give a crap about these kids' inner circle's jealousy drama. As a unit, it is engaging to see the kids working together to survive and see them over time gradually open up to each other. It does say something very sweet about nostalgia and family and growing up, and those themes blend well with the supernatural elements. But again, we spend most of the film with these two who spend most of the film bickering, and the alpha bitch is a perpetual buzzkill. Even though I know it's still understandable for the kids to be a little bit on edge in a terrifying survival situation. It's not as though these kids aren't well characterized, their character journeys are comprehensive, but that all just makes it a little harder to enjoy this film.
Super dog. He's a superhero.
DC League of Super Pets is a big studio animated movie that does big studio animated movie things. It has celebrities. Sometimes it is funny. Sometimes it is very unfunny. Sometimes it is heartwarming. Dwayne Johnson opted for a producer credit and then did virtually no advertising because he was up on his Black Adam drama. He isn't nearly as endearing here as he is as Maui. Still, likely this is the best theatrical Justice League. The turtle is funny. Yeah, okay, it's about as movie studio generic as they come, but thanks to the personality bits given to the Justice League and Ace and the evil hamster, it leans more on the side of comfortably generic rather than obnoxiously generic. I will give it that. That is all I have to say about it.
Non-union crew, they don't know what they're doing, but they're gonna make movie magic.
Weirdly, movies about making movies tend to be some favorites of cinephiles. Pompo is about a genius film producer who could be an actual child, but in anime you never know if characters are actually high schoolers or in their 50s. Either way, is the daughter of a producer who has inherited all of his assets and is always making fun, semi-trashy B-films that are always hits. But this story isn't really about her. It's about her protege, Gene, and his journey of making his very first film under her tutelage. And certainly there's quite a few things for film buffs to appreciate, from watching the process of a movie getting made and all of the details and barriers, and watching Gene gain confidence in his abilities as he stretches his creative muscles. During a particularly tense editing sequence, I resonated with a sentiment that I had learned from one of my very first video production courses, where he has to make the hard decisions, decide on what to keep and what to cut. I remembered a phrase that was said to me during my first video film production class. You need to get rid of A work to get A plus work. I feel like a lot of writers can relate to that as well. However, the general tone about this movie is that it is very overly optimistic about filmmaking in the film industry, so creative young audiences might have been drawn to that, but I am jaded as Ivy. And because of that, I heavily beefed with a lot of the stuff that this movie says. And not just disagreeing, I think it makes its own philosophical cases poorly. Whether it's miserable people are automatically more creative than happy people. Wow. And then while it's true that it takes a lot of work and sacrifice to be a great artist, but when our protagonist has literally nothing going on in his life to sacrifice except his health, it sounds rather tone-deaf coming from the country with a notorious dying from overwork problem. And then posturing about how all movies need to be under 90 minutes, when to get this movie under 90 minutes, its ending frankly sucks. And you might think it's low to chastise this movie just for disagreeing with its message. I don't think it's completely out of a question if a movie spends like a quarter of its runtime shoving its filmmaking philosophies in your face, but I also think that it shafts the development of the star Natalie, who has a whole section dedicated to her and doesn't really do anything with it. And then the whole, like, bank funding thing I think it's stupid. So yeah, to me, Pompo is what I usually dub a YouTube clip movie. There are definitely some impressive scenes that are just as effective to watch them isolated, but are not done any favors to watch it as a whole. It's a very pretty pastry with a really bad aftertaste.
As the years go by, our friendship will never die. You're gonna see it's our destiny.
I missed this one in last year's list, but I'm kind of glad that I could put it on this one as just another addition to what was ultimately a really great year for stop motion. A collaboration between several European countries. Even Mice Belong in Heaven follows a mouse who goes to heaven with the fox that was chasing her. And in heaven, each of the animals gradually becomes more equal in size, loses many of their aggressive or defensive characteristics so that they can all get along as equals. But obviously, even with that, some can't let go of their perceptions or traumatic experiences of certain species. I like a good oppositional pair that learn to be friends story, but it does feel a tad disingenuous to just not acknowledge the predator-preyness of it all. I mean, of course they acknowledge it, but it's like the mouse's antagonism is a personal prejudice and the fox is one of the good ones. And that just doesn't fit in this situation. At least they called out some hypocrisy. The fox points out mice eat bugs, and the mouse goes, "What? Bugs don't count!" Hey, you know that joke about looking behind you? And in comparison to the others on this list, the stop motion is decent, but it's also very limited. Not a whole lot of facial expressions going on. But really, the star of the movie is just all of the little details in this post-death world, having all these areas to help inhabitants adjust and move on. And in general, I just like a family movie that talks about death this frankly. At its base, it's just a nice friendship story with some creative ideas and a sweet ending.
Generic 90s grunge song. Everyone in Flanders. Generic 90s grunge song. Something from Seattle.
I've never watched Beavis and Butt-Head, and I knew very little about it except that it was technically the origin of personal fave Daria. And the depths of their characters are exactly as every impression of them. That their main gimmick is laughing whenever somebody says sounds even vaguely sexual. I didn't think I was going to get anything out of this, however, Mike Judd is an animation icon for a reason. It's an incredibly simple premise that everyone around them makes assumptions about their behavior, from saying that they're just not challenged enough to just straight geniuses, because they just can't comprehend that they're just idiots. Or even in situations where they think it wouldn't be polite to just assume that they're just idiots. And it oddly works. Here the two get wrangled into a space program which, through a series of classic misunderstandings and a attempted murder, send them back through a black hole to the future where they can do their usual stick, but now with modern stuff. And of course, there is an extended joke of them thinking that Siri is a real person. But the astronauts recognize them from the past and so decide to finish the attempted murder they failed at. So this is just classic farce comedy. There isn't anything as dazzling in this one as that scene from their previous movie where they're tripping on mushrooms, and the feature length might have been pushing my limits a tad, but this works fine for the premise that it is.
You are so young and you are so free, but you're brainless, and I can't help but see that you don't know what you really need. Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Okay, we're just gonna need a speed run through a bunch of okay if you feel like it films. I was wondering while watching why Don Gleeson felt so familiar, and it wasn't because The Forest makes you think of Stand By Me, though that was an influence. It's because it has a lot of similar beats and made by many of the same people as A Place Further Than the Universe, one of my favorite anime series of all time, only this is Boys in the Woods instead of Girls in Antarctica. It's generally very sweet and well made, but it also has the world's cringiest dub scene where a bunch of English-speaking boys have to pretend to not know the words to Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Nothing 4Kids has done has hurt me more than this scene. Overall, Donglish is fine, and I give it a lot of credit for its ending, but for a fantastically characterized friendship and coming-of-age story, A Place Further Than the Universe is better. And in line with films that are objectively decent, but you keep being distracted by the similarities to better works, Dear King drastically suffers from, it's nice, but we have Princess Mononoke at home. Because it really does seem like this movie's premise was manifested by someone poorly describing Princess Mononoke. Okay, so there's this guy with a thing on his arm, and there's an amorphous demon thing, and there's a girl riding wolves, protag riding a deer that's technically not a deer. Really, this movie is based on a novel, and it feels like it, because it throws a deluge of fantasy lore and names from countries to people to in-universe historical events that, at the end, I still didn't have a good grip on. At its core, it's a story about a father trying to save his daughter, and it's very pretty. But this is not a story that should have been squeezed into 90 minutes. Crypto Zoo. No, not the crypto scam. Cryptids, like legendary mythological creatures. Crypto Zoo is really a sanctuary. It's broadly the format of a supernatural outsiders versus the government and traffickers, while pondering how exactly to deal with the presence of cryptids. Is it safer to keep them secret or allow Crypto Zoo to become a tourist attraction and try to normalize them? The animation's obviously rough, but you can respect an indie production for doing their best with what they had, especially when creating a unique scrapbook look and the sheer number of cryptids they try to give the spotlight to. But it's another case of a film where it throws a lot at you and it can be hard to catch up, but it's nice to see a crew doing something different. Sing a Bit of Harmony is literally Megan, but if she worked properly. An AI who wants to make her friend happy, but does it by singing, and not by murdering people. Generally a sweet film that makes you a little bit less afraid of AI, which is exactly what they want. And gotta say, I am over the girl that heals the world by singing. I have been done with that since people started putting song lyrics in their fanfics, so basically I've been done with it for 100 years. Chip and Dale. I do wish that a live CG hybrid whose premise seemed to actually care about animation somewhat had done a better job with the actual animation, but even if it is a subpar Roger Rabbit, it's still more creative, took more chances with playful dark humor in this film than most family films have been in the past couple years. Night at the Museum, where we evolved the concept to an art museum where we can now use art pieces as time portals. That's actually a little clever. It's better than I expected, certainly where the animation is concerned, but you still have the issue where you have 10 plus characters who all have one gimmick that they keep repeating, and it gets a little old. Chicken Hair and the Hamster of Darkness. Well, I certainly can't blame this one for having a generic one-word title. The thing that stands out to me about this one is how so seriously it takes its premise. Where most other kid films feel like they have to be at least somewhat jokey, this is in the vein of a traditional Indiana Jones film, for kids obviously, that's fairly focused on the adventure part. I also remember that the turtle sidekick had this tendency of sounding like a YouTuber commentary track in the way that he was constantly pointing out nitpicks in a sarcastic voice. Fortune Favors Lady Nikuko pretty much does exactly what I thought it'd do when its protagonist is a cartoonishly obese character, visually emphasizing how large and gross she is, matched by her being mockably boisterous in all other manners of expression, from her clothing to her loud, flirty, childlike behavior. But it's okay, because she's so caring and she just doesn't care what other people think, which is ultimately the lesson that her daughter has to learn, both with her mother and her classmates. It's well animated with some genuine sentimental moments, and I do like the line, acting like a child is a thing that adults made up. That's true, but this is grown-worthy typical. And I know it's Japan. I know that there are different standards in terms of what constitutes fat, but do you know how much exactly this woman weighs? 147 pounds. Really?
100 billion galaxies that stretch across the sky, filled with constellations, planets, moons, and stars. And still the universe extends to a place that never ends, which is maybe just inside a little jar.
So, Disney didn't have a great year, at least in comparison to itself. Sure, there were compounding factors between really dumb choices, in terms of which Disney movies to put in theaters this year, poor choices in advertising when it even existed, audiences getting used to seeing Pixar movies on Plus, but it could also be that these were just two of the least interesting animated films that Disney has done in a while. Neither of these is terrible, and are generally well animated and decently written. If you weren't interested from the trailers, then they might actually surprise you. But an increasingly competitive market, both for animation and entertainment in general, even if you're Disney, it's growing to be not good enough just to be good enough. Lightyear feels like a film that was a corporate mandate to make another Toy Story tie-in that no one really wanted or was passionate about. Relatively decent execution of a pretty mediocre premise, and Strange World had mixed execution on actually a pretty good premise. But while they both felt a little autopilot, they both had experimental or at least less common attributes, making them a little different than what Disney usually does. Lightyear attempted to have a more subdued, dramatic tone, and Strange World tried to bring back exploratory adventures. Will we finally make a semi-steampunk movie that kind of works, in a way that commented on philosophical differences of the generations? And I feel like both of these movies would have been bigger successes, at least critically, if they had leaned harder into those unique aspects. At least where Lightyear is concerned, feels like the initial drive was to make a drama, but then someone was like, it's a kid's movie, it can't be too dramatic, which is not the impression a Pixar film should ever make you think. But more than that, its dramatic, character-oriented story was just kind of basic. And then there was Zurg, which yes, does work thematically with what they were going for, but only re-emphasizes that Buzz's arc is just kind of boring. And there was nothing interesting about this planet, which is still the biggest thing that baffles me. And everyone agrees you should have just taken the cues from the animated show and made it a pulpy 60s style space adventure in the Incredibles universe. Strange World at the very least had an interesting world, but then overpacked it with characters that weren't necessary and failed to make the important ones pop. Again, I generally like the concept of this, you just needed to write script better. This was the reverse of Pixar's usual skill of managing expectations. It's beneficial to start with a somewhat kiddie premise that turns out to be surprisingly deep. It's not nearly as effective to start out with a premise that looks deep and turns out to be surprisingly shallow. And the part of me that was a little bit pleased that this one didn't do well, because at least they'd stop milking the Toy Story franchise, well, so much for that!